Imagine this. One moment, you're in the lush, tropical mountains of Trelawny Town, Jamaica. It's the only home you've ever known, a place your ancestors fought to make autonomous. Then, almost overnight, you're ripped away and find yourself on the rugged, freezing, fog-covered coast of Halifax, Nova Scotia. This wasn't some kind of willing resettlement. This was a radical, forced uprooting in the late 1700s. And that shocking journey, that jarring transition, is really the heart of our deep dive today. We're focusing on the Trelawny Town Maroons. These were legendary defenders of their independence. But in 1796, they found themselves exiled, stripped of their power, basically, and shipped across the ocean to this distant, cold north.
It really is a dark and quite complex chapter in colonial history. And our mission today is to take you inside the sources to really understand the complicated political reasons, the strategic thinking behind this sudden deportation. We'll get into the Maroons' brief, very difficult 4 years in Canada, everything from building infrastructure for the British to struggling with a harsh climate and really poor land. And then finally, we'll trace their ultimate, quite surprising final destination.
Okay, so to really grasp the exile, we need to rewind just a bit. We have to talk about the conflict that came right before it, the Second Maroon War. That was 1795 to 1796. And this wasn't just some spontaneous thing, right? It was more like a boiling point reached after, decades of tension simmering away. The original treaty between the Maroons and the British was basically falling apart.
Yeah, and what's fascinating, or maybe just predictable, is how basic colonial economics just completely shredded the agreements. You had these sugar plantations expanding, always expanding, and they pushed closer and closer to lands the Maroons saw as theirs. But even worse, the British brought in these really tough restrictions on things core to the Maroons' way of life, hunting, farming. It feels very calculated, like they were trying to dismantle their self-sufficiency, push them towards relying on the colonial system.
Right. Undermining their independence bit by bit. And if that slow economic squeeze wasn't enough, there was that one specific incident, a moment of real cultural, political humiliation that just lit the fuse for the war. In 1795, 2 Maroons accused of stealing pigs were publicly flogged in Montego Bay. Now that seems like a pretty small thing, relatively speaking, to start a major war over. How could the British have misjudged the impact of that so badly?
Well, for the Trelawny Town Maroons, it wasn't really about the pigs themselves. It was about status, about autonomy, that public flogging. It was seen as a huge violation of their treaty rights, however diminished they were. It felt like an attempt to treat them, a free community, like they were enslaved laborers. That feeling of deep injustice, of disrespect, that was the spark. And the conflict flared up fast. Key leaders like Colonel Montague James and Captain Leonard Parkinson were right at the forefront.
And they knew their terrain. They used classic Maroon tactics, didn't they? Guerrilla warfare, quick strikes, ambushes. It immediately created a really difficult, very costly stalemate for the British forces. Even when the British brought in reinforcements, even those infamous bloodhounds from Cuba, they just couldn't get a decisive win.
Exactly. The war just became too expensive, too frustrating for the British. So negotiations started, and a truce was, on paper at least, reached. The Maroons agreed to lay down their arms, surrender key leaders, and in return, they were promised amnesty, and they could continue living freely in their territory.
But that truce, as history shows us, was basically worthless almost immediately. What happened right after that turned this negotiated peace into forced exile?
This is where you really see a calculated piece of colonial policy taking shape. The new governor of Jamaica, Alexander Lindsay, he was the Earl of Balcarres. He violated the spirit, if not the absolute letter, of that agreement almost instantly. The sources are pretty clear about why. It was fear. Fear combined with intense political pressure from the planters and the assembly.
So was Balcarres just reacting? Or was it more of a cold political calculation? Was there any debate among the British about, breaking this truce?
It really seems like it was a calculated political move, a concession perhaps. You had these panicked planters, this hostile colonial assembly. They were terrified. The idea of letting the Maroons, who had just fought the British military to a standstill, remain autonomous on the island, that was seen as just too big a risk. They basically decided the potential cost of future resistance was higher than the cost of breaking the promise right now. So the decision was made. Instead of amnesty, they deported over 500 Maroons. And remember, that includes men, women, children, shipped them off to Nova Scotia in 1796. It's a really stark reminder of how easily those promises could be broken when a group was seen as, politically inconvenient.
Okay, let's follow that journey. Sailing from the tropics, the only climate they'd ever known. They arrive in Halifax, Nova Scotia around July 1796. The scale is just.
That's hard to picture.
Somewhere between 500 and 600 Trelawny Town Maroons forced onto ships for this journey north.
Yeah, and when they arrived, they immediately faced the physical reality of Nova Scotia. Their first housing was very temporary, pretty basic. We're talking tents, old barracks, some repurposed buildings up on Citadel Hill, even barns, apparently, on the governor's own property. But they weren't just left there. They were immediately put to work, essentially to offset the cost of keeping them there.
And here's where that sort of strategic exploitation really kicks in, isn't it? They're seen as dangerous, politically inconvenient, but also incredibly valuable laborers. So they're immediately put to work fortifying Citadel Hill, working on other military projects, infrastructure stuff that was crucial for the British presence there.
That's the absolute paradox. Think about it. You're building this huge fortress, a symbol of the very colonial power that exiled you in this freezing, totally alien climate. And you're using the skills, the masonry, the organization you honed back in the mountains of Jamaica. The physical proof is still there today. They actually constructed one of the bastions at Citadel Hill. It's still known as the Maroon Bastion. It just shows their value right up until they became too difficult to manage politically.
So despite this really critical contribution to Halifax's defenses, the plan under Governor John Wentworth wasn't for them to just be builders indefinitely. The longer-term idea was settlement, trying to integrate them, specifically pushing agriculture in the Preston area.
Right, but this plan was just fundamentally flawed from the start. It quickly became clear it wasn't sustainable. There were several factors, really, that just created this deep dissatisfaction. The whole system was sort of doomed to fail.
What were the main things that torpedoed that agricultural settlement idea?
Well, first off, the land itself. The land they were given in Preston. It was just terrible quality. Rocky, thin soil. Classic Nova Scotia geology, really. Completely unsuitable for people used to farming rich, tropical, volcanic earth. Second, the climate shock. I mean, just the sheer adjustment from the tropics to surviving a northern winter. It was profound. And then on top of all that practical difficulty, there was cultural pressure. Active attempts by colonial authorities, particularly missionaries, to convert them to Christianity, that just added another layer of alienation for a community already struggling to hold on to its identity in this completely foreign place.
That makes sense. So this failure to adapt, under impossible conditions really, it inevitably led to tensions, divisions within the Maroon community itself. Sounds like they were trying anything they could.
Exactly. Most stayed in Preston, struggling along, writing petitions, asking for help or relocation. But some tried a different approach. We know a group led by a prominent Maroon leader named James Palmer actually moved about 14 miles away. They set up near a small community called Boydville. They were trying to find maybe more viable land, a bit more autonomy, make their own settlement work. But even that splinter group really struggled. The whole situation was just untenable for almost everyone.
Okay, so the Nova Scotia administration has this skilled population. They're not adapting to farming. They're not integrating quietly. They're seen as too difficult, too independent. What was the ultimate British solution for what was becoming a costly problem?
Well, if you connect the dots to earlier events, it actually mirrors what happened to another displaced group shortly before. The proposed solution for the Maroons was resettlement, again, this time to the colony of Sierra Leone in West Africa.
All right, let's pause on that parallel. You mentioned the Black Loyalists earlier. For listeners maybe familiar with the Maroons, but less so with 18th century Nova Scotia, can you just clarify that connection quickly?
Oh, absolutely. Good point. So the Black Loyalists were freed Black people, refugees from the American Revolution. They'd been promised land and freedom in Nova Scotia by the British. But very similarly, they ended up facing systemic poverty, really bad land grants, marginalization, and a large group of them, thousands actually, were relocated from Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone in the early 1790s. So the Maroon situation, just a few years later, it kind of repeated that same pattern. Colonial promises broken, settlement failure, and then disposal, essentially, through relocation.
And this Maroon resettlement was managed by the Sierra Leone Company.
That's right. The company was this British organization, part philanthropic, part commercial. It was founded by abolitionists, people like Granville Sharp. They managed the Freetown colony in Sierra Leone. So for the Maroons, this wasn't just another unknown land. It was a place where other displaced people of African descent, including those earlier Black Loyalists, former slaves, were trying to build a new society. It was definitely imperfect, but it was seen as a more viable option than staying in the cold, dealing with the broken promises of Nova Scotia.
So while it might have been presented as an opportunity, it was also pretty much the only way out, wasn't it? They couldn't go back to Jamaica. Nova Scotia wasn't working.
That's essentially the reality behind the official solution, yeah. So in August 1800, over 500 Maroons left Nova Scotia bound for Sierra Leone. Though it's interesting, our sources do mention that a very small number actually chose to stay behind in Nova Scotia. Maybe they'd formed personal ties, or maybe just couldn't face another huge sea voyage. We don't really know for sure.
So their time in North America was short, just 4 years. But they definitely left their mark on the landscape, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. They make sure their story wasn't completely erased. You've got the Citadel Hill Maroon Bastion, of course, but there's also still a place called Maroon Hill. It's in the Sackville area near Halifax, named specifically after the Maroons who tried to settle near there, including that group James Palmer led in Boydville. These place names, they really do honor the presence and the history of a people who were exiled, not just once, but twice, basically, for insisting on their independence.
When you put it all together, the Maroon story in Nova Scotia, it's just such a powerful testament to colonial injustice, broken treaties, but also that relentless struggle for self-determination. They had to navigate a completely alien world, hold on to their culture, maintain their resistance, even while their skills were being used to literally build the defenses of the power that had betrayed them.
Indeed. That resilience, that refusal to just quietly assimilate into a system that had violated their trust, that ultimately led to their second huge relocation, a journey across 3 continents in less than 10 years. It's quite extraordinary.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. We talked about that historical parallel, the earlier Black Loyalist relocation, which was apparently a long, difficult process. So what does the speed and the decisiveness of the Maroon resettlement to Sierra Leone just a few years later tell you about the colonial administration's real priorities? Especially when faced with a population they saw as too independent, maybe just too difficult to control or absorb. Did that earlier failure maybe make them more determined, perhaps more ruthless in dealing with the Maroons? Something to think about, that historical echo, next time you consider the names etched onto the landscape of Halifax.